In the 1950s, a horrific accident put one man on an obsessive quest. Most of his neighbors said that he had gone insane, but he swore that what he was doing wasn't crazy. He was protecting them from supernatural forces. And it worked for 50 years until one day in April of 2001, it eventually took his life. You won't want to miss this one. Don Julian Santana Barrera was born in Mexico on October 22nd, 1921. Although we don't know much about his early life, we do know that he found his way to the secrets of Mexico City in the early 1950s. And at first, he sold produce, but eventually he would fall on hard times and resorted to begging. And after being mistreated by other residents, he then decided that all he wanted to do was to be left alone. And then he moved to a small island in the capital's Xochimilco district, an island that soon became infamous. Now, to understand what happened next, you need to know something about this area. Xochimilco is one of the oldest parts of Mexico City. In fact, its construction alone stretches back to the Aztecs, a destination that earned it a designation as a United Nations World Heritage Site. The entire district is just crisscrossed by numerous canals, floating gardens, and artificial islands, all of which attract flocks of tourists. Now, the tourists also come to see something else. They come to see Don Julian's Isla de Moañicas, or Island of the Dolls. Basically, Don Julian gave up on society. He became a hermit. He moved into a simple hut on one of the district's many artificial islands, only about an acre of land in the middle of one of the canals. And he lived completely alone and tended a small garden, meaning he only left when he needed to trade some of his produce for goods and services. Then, when that was done, he would simply return to his lonely home in peace. Now, it should have been a rather lonely and serene existence, and for a while it was, until one night when tragedy struck. Now, we still don't know exactly when it happened. Most people say that the accident occurred in the 1950s, others say that it took place a little earlier, but everyone agrees that Don Julian was on the island when this took place. You see, according to the story, one night Don Julian heard something splashing in one of the canals near his island, and then he set out to find the source of the disturbance. His thought at first was that it actually might have been an animal, but no, it wasn't. It was a person. In fact, it was a young girl, and clearly she had become tangled in the thick vegetation on the banks of the canal, and had unfortunately not been able to escape in time. And despite every attempt he made, Don Julian could not bring her back to life. And unfortunately, the young girl had drowned in one of Xochimilco's dark waterways. And so Don Julian was devastated. I mean, remember, he may have been a loner, but he was still a human being, and he couldn't bear to see innocent life cut short. And then Don Julian saw it. An object that would define the rest of his life. There, floating in the canal near the body of the dead girl, was a doll. And Don went over, picked it up, and brought it with him ashore. And he didn't know why, but it only seemed like it was right to keep it, to honor its former owner. And so Don Julian hung up the doll in a nearby tree. Now, according to some versions of the story, Don Julian actually had clear motivation for doing this. I mean, some people say that he heard a voice on the wind, faint but clear, and it said, "I want my doll." Either way, it was the start of something that would eventually become world famous. You see, Don Julian began filling the island with dolls. He would rummage through trash heaps in the hope of finding them, and he began fishing them out of the canals, and oddly enough, they even washed ashore, all on their own, as if they were somehow drawn to him. Now, eventually, by the time he died, Don Julian had collected about 1,500 dolls. Now, to give you an idea of how much he valued them, he would even head into town and trade his own produce for dolls. In fact, he didn't even care the condition they were in. And remember, the crops that Don Julian grew were his only form of currency. I mean, clearly he valued these simple toys even over the bare basic necessities. And then, whenever a new doll found its way to him, Don Julian would simply just put it on display. Now, where did he put them? Well, everywhere, using nails, wires, string, any way he could. He just put them up wherever. He would attach them to trees, to fences, the exterior walls of his hut, and the other 2 small buildings he had also made. In fact, he even put them on display on the inside of his small home. And it was here that he kept what he called Agustineta, which was the first doll he ever found, the one along with the drowned girl. And after hanging her from a tree, that sounds pretty morbid, I mean the doll, he eventually moved her inside and even built a small shrine for her. Little creepy. And each time he put up a new doll, Don Julian never bothered to clean or repair them. Regardless of what state they were in, the dolls or pieces of them simply went on display as they were. And this led to hundreds of tiny disembodied heads, torsos, and limbs scattered all across the island of the dolls. Now clearly, Don had become obsessed, but why? Well, he never really told many people. In fact, one of the few people he explained his obsession to was his great nephew, Rogelio Sanchez Santana, who also manages the island of the dolls today. And Rogelio would explain that the spirit of the girl who had died was now living in sorrow, and in the mornings, Julian started seeing ghosts, and on one day, he woke up and found that all of his crops had mysteriously died. And so he tried many different things to try and improve his crops, but because he couldn't and was convinced the spirit of the girl did it, he just became more and more frightened by the whole thing. And so he began collecting dolls as a sort of way to protect himself from this spirit. Basically, Don became convinced that the only way to protect himself and his garden was to put up as many dolls as possible. Now again, at first he was terrified, and each night he would hear whispers in the darkness, as well as the unmistakable sound of feet moving across his island. And sometimes he could even hear the unmistakable voice of weeping, even screaming. I guess it's more of a sound, not a voice, but you get the idea. Now, clearly it was a female voice, and remember, he was supposed to be all alone on this island. And even locals started hearing these disturbances. This wasn't just an isolated case of schizophrenia here. Like, this was a thing. And they began to really be freaked out and stay away from Don Julian and this island. And even some locals today still refuse to go anywhere near the island of the dolls. But then, according to the story, Don Julian began putting up the dolls and everything changed, because the strange happenings became less and less frequent, or at least they became less and less threatening. Now, according to some, Don Julian said that the dolls started protecting him, meaning that they would actually appear to him in the middle of the night, moving all on their own, to accompany his movement around the island. And Don Julian swore that they were protecting him and the surrounding area from evil spirits. Now, despite his newfound safety, Don Julian still remained alone. You see, for the longest time, locals still refused to visit the island of the dolls, and the only person to visit him was his nephew. And even those visits were rare. Outside of the immediate area, no one even knew that much about it. So it wasn't until 1991 that the island of the dolls came to the attention of the outside world. That was when a work crew ventured into the canals to clear out debris, and then they stumbled upon the site, and folks, the rest is history. Almost overnight, the island of the dolls became a hot spot for what is known as dark tourism, and that's where people visit scary places on purpose. While most local boatmen feared the island of the dolls, others capitalized on it. cha-ching, and started offering rides for visitors. What those early sightseers found simply shocked them. Remember, we're talking about well over 1,000 dolls here, and boy, did they look creepy. I mean, if you take a look at any of the thousands of photos of this place on the internet, by the way, this place is very well known about it. It's very well documented. You'll get the idea. Body parts strung everywhere, decapitated heads staring at you with missing eyes and frozen smiles. I mean, everything from Barbies to soft-bodied dolls the size of actual newborns. It's pretty downright creepy. Now, it wasn't long before tourists began reporting their own experiences from the Island of the Dolls, and they all have very similar stories to tell. Some people swear that they see the heads and eyes of the dolls following them, kind of like in a Scooby-Doo episode. Others say that their limbs or eyelids move on their own, something that the wind simply shouldn't be able to do. People still hear whispers on the island, but nobody knows if they come from the ghost of the drowned girl or from the dolls themselves. And supposedly, as the sun sets, shadow figures start appearing here and there, just weaving their way between the trees and decorated with plastic body parts. But as tempting as it might be, don't think that you can simply steal a souvenir from the Island of the Dolls and get away with it. Because anyone foolish enough to take a doll from the island reports a sudden rush of bad luck headed their way. I'm talking everything from financial ruin to car accidents, even death have been reported after taking something from Don Julian's collection. Now, as far as the owner of the Island of the Dolls, he didn't really fight his new status as a celebrity. Instead, he began making a little money off it. I mean, at first, he just sold his produce to tourists, and then he began collecting a small fee from visitors. But he didn't talk much about his life or what caused him to start collecting the dolls, at least at first. Over the years, he slowly opened up and began to explain his obsession more and more, especially if he was inebriated. Overall, for him, it was a good arrangement and an easier life than Don Julian had ever known, but it was not meant to last. And so 10 years after the Island of the Dolls became internationally famous, the spirits claimed Don Julian once and for all. It was Tuesday, April 17th, 2001, and Don Julian's nephew had come to visit him, and at first everything was normal, the day was fine, they had started with a little work here and there on his crops, and then, when the work was done, they decided to do a little fishing in the canal. And Don Julian hooked and lost the same fish twice, and he finally caught it, though, and proudly showed his catch to his nephew, and he even told them that, "I already have it, the one that escaped me," and he seemed overjoyed. And remember, Don Julian was not thinking about harming himself in any way whatsoever, but Don Julian's nephew smiled as his uncle explained why the fish had escaped twice. You see, he said that something had been interfering with him while he was fishing. He claimed that there was a mermaid in the canal, and she kept singing to him. And Don Julian was convinced that she wanted to take him away. Obviously, the nephew was surprised to hear this, but Don told him that there was nothing to worry about, that he had been singing back to the mermaid, and that was enough to keep her from dragging him into the canal. Now, I can only imagine that the nephew simply just smiled and rolled his eyes at his uncle. In the meantime, he still had things to do, and Don had added some livestock to his small farm on the island, and there was still work to be done. And so the nephew just told him that he's going to go milk the cows and he'll be right back and to be careful. And, so he left and does his thing, and he was only gone for a short amount of time. But when he returned, he looked for Don but couldn't find him anywhere. And that was when his nephew found him. He wasn't on the ground, he was in the canal and not moving. Don was dead, drowned in fact, and there was no sign of a struggle. There wasn't any reason for him to have drowned, but it was at the exact same spot on the shore where he always said that he found the body of the little girl all those years ago. Now, if that's not strange and bizarre, then I don't know what is. But just because Don Julian is gone, it doesn't mean that his legacy is. Mexico City's Island of the Dolls is more popular than ever. I mean, tourists looking for a scary time still come to the island regularly. And Don Julian's great-nephew, Rogelio, still runs the operation, along with his uncle. The site is maintained through donations and entrance fees, both of which continue to pour in. And in fact, some people believe that coming to the Island of the Dolls and making an offering to the original doll that Don Julian found can apparently result in being blessed by the supernatural forces that still seem to dwell on the island. But these spirits aren't exactly alone. You see, in his later years, Don always walked with a cane, and it made a distinctive noise as he traveled across the island. And now, the few people who are brave enough to visit this place at night say they can still hear the sound of Don's cane as he wanders back and forth. That's like the most typical ghost tale, right? And he's supposedly still examining his collection of dolls even after his death. Now, while that is all fun and games, the Island of the Dolls is certainly a creepy place, and it doesn't really seem to have directly caused anyone's death. But the same can't be said for another island halfway across the world. But before we get to that, as far as Don, his nephew, the little girl that died, and the strange circumstances surrounding the legend of his death and the dolls and all these supposed supernatural things that go on this small little artificial island, it remains a mystery. Gaiola Island sits just off the coast of Naples, Italy, in the Tyrrhenian Sea. If the Island of the Dolls looks disturbing, then Gaiola Island couldn't be any different. In fact, its picturesque appearance and extreme proximity to the mainland, I mean, it's only about 100 feet from shore, have enticed many people over the years to visit, but folks, as we all know, looks can be deceiving. You see, despite being so attractive, it is actually illegal to set foot on Gaiola Island. The official explanation is that it is part of the underwater park of Gaiola, a protected marine reserve in the Gulf of Naples. But everyone knows that there is another far more disturbing and sinister reason. You see, Gaiola Island has a long history, ancient in fact. Its uses stretch back to Roman times, and it's even said that the famous poet Virgil once taught students there. Well, while that's just a legend, we know for a fact that the small island has been home to Roman villas and factories. Until relatively recently, Gaiola Island was considered a paradise, but then, in the 19th century, things took a turn for the worse. Basically, the curse of Gaiola Island, called by the locals the Gaiola malediction, seems to have begun after a mysterious character took up residence there. People have even called him Il Mago, or the Wizard. And like Don Julian, he lived alone, spending his days as a hermit. Basically, he relied solely on the generosity of local fishermen for his food and other basic necessities. And then something strange happened. Overnight, the wizard was gone, completely disappeared, vanished. Fishermen pulled up to Gaiola Island, expecting to see him, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. Now, some people say that this is the origin of the Gaiola malediction, and in short, they believe that the hermit put a curse on the island. But others disagree. They claim that the students of Virgil, while studying dark magic, polluted the surrounding waters with mystical potions. And still, others think that the island was cursed even earlier by legendary creatures from Greek mythology. But whatever the case may be, the island has seen more than its fair share of death and, of course, ruined lives. You see, after the wizard's disappearance, Gaiola Island was bought in the 1870s by Luigi de Negri, who was a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in the fishery business. And today, you could still see the villa that he built on the island. And his paradise soon fell apart. Just a short time after building his home, Luigi's fishing empire fell into complete and utter financial ruin. And so the property went up for auction. It was passed between a handful of owners, including Nelson Foley, who's the brother-in-law to famed Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, before eventually falling into the possession of Giuseppe Paratore, who is an Italian senator. But the curse was still in effect. The next victim that the island would claim was Captain Gasperi Albenga. Now, Gaspera had expressed an interest in buying the property, but as he navigated around Gaiola Island in 1911, well, his ship struck rocks and he drowned. It's unclear what happened after that. Locals swear that neither his body nor the ship were ever found. Well, the next owner suffered an even worse fate. A wealthy man from Switzerland by the name of Hans Braun purchased Gaiola Island in the 1920s, and he was found murdered. His body rolled up in a rug left inside the villa, and the murderer was never found. And a short time later, his widow drowned in the sea. Gosh, this is dark. And then Gaiola Island was bought by German citizen Otto Grunbach, who used it as a vacation home. And on one of his first visits, well, I think you guys get where this is going. Now, before I tell you, I want you to sit there and try and guess how he died. Okay, I'll tell you. He had a fatal heart attack. Around the same time, in 1926, rumors then spread that a woman traveling on a cable car connected between Gaiola Island and the mainland had apparently been swept out to sea, which would be a horrible way to die, especially knowing that you're about to die. And obviously, she was never to be heard from again. Now, Gaiola Island's next owner deserves a special mention because his interest in the property might suggest exactly why the island was cursed. You see, on paper, Maurice Yves Sandoz was a Swiss pharmaceutical industrialist and a writer, but the content of his writing might be interesting to the fans of what lurks beneath. In short, he wrote horror. But Maurice wasn't just any horror author, he seemed to be well versed in the same stuff that we are. In fact, one of his novels, 1945's The Maze, is actually based on the beast of Glamis Castle, a subject I'll be covering in the future. And his other work also shows signs that he was interested in science fiction, as well as the occult, involving supernatural and futuristic elements. In fact, Maurice even wrote a play based on the English legend of Spring-Heeled Jack, an entity that terrorized Victorian Londoners. Now, what do you guys make of this connection? Was Maurice drawn to Gaiola Island because he knew that it held some sort of secret occultic power? Well, Maurice's stay on the island didn't end too well, unsurprisingly, because after purchasing the villa, he wound up in a mental hospital in Switzerland, where he eventually took his own life. And the next victim that Gaiola Island would claim was Baron Karl Paul Langheim, who's owner of a German steel empire. Although everyone said that he went bankrupt from living a wild and crazy party-filled lifestyle, it's clear that the Gaiola malediction might have had something to do with it. And to recover his losses, the Baron sold the villa to its most famous owner, Giovanni Agnelli, owner of the Italian car company Fiat, was the next person to own Gaiola Island. And it wasn't long after his purchase of the villa before tragedy struck. You see, Gaiola Island has long since eroded into two separate landmasses. A short bridge connects the two. Giovanni's first tragedy was the discovery of his son's body underneath this very bridge. It was ruled a suicide. And then Giovanni's nephew, whom Giovanni had selected to take over his company, was diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer. And as you guys can imagine, the nephew died shortly thereafter at the age of 33. A little bit of a Masonic symbolism going on there, huh? It's hard to believe, but despite its ominous history, people kept buying Gaiola Island. It's just too beautiful and tempting. So the next owner was American billionaire John Paul Getty, and clearly he had no regard for the Gaiola malediction. But it didn't matter. The curse found him anyway. Getty's 16-year-old grandson was famously kidnapped by the Calabrian Mafia in 1973, and they demanded a hefty ransom for his return. Now, at first, Getty just thought that the Mafia was bluffing, and in response, they sent the boy's grandfather some of his hair, as well as his severed ear. Getty eventually paid $33 million to have him returned safely, and Getty also had to endure the premature deaths of his oldest and youngest sons. And so Giolla Island passed into the hands of its final owner, Gian Pasquale Grapponi, the owner of a lucrative insurance company, and his habit of risky business deals and unpaid debts soon landed him in prison. Well, the curse wasn't done with Gian Pasquale either. His wife suffered a fatal car accident shortly after he had been put in jail. And at last, in 1978, Giolla Island was purchased by the Italian government, and it soon became a protected marine reserve, with visitors strictly forbidden from setting foot on its shores. Today, the villa continues to crumble from neglect, and the waves keep eroding the rocks it sits on. And for decades, the island has remained uninhabited. But was this the end of the curse? No, of course not. Come on, guys. In fact, the curse popped up in the news again as recently as 2009, because that year, Franco Ambrosio and his wife, Giovanna Sacco, were found murdered on Giolla Island. Now, they lived on the mainland just across from the villa, and eventually 3 individuals, including one who worked as their gardener, was charged with their deaths. So, what caused the Giolla malediction to begin with? I mean, we've talked about a couple of possibilities here, but there's one that we haven't. Now remember, the villa on Giolla Island was actually owned for a short while by an Italian senator, Giuseppe Paratore. Well, apparently the senator's nephew made a shocking discovery in the mid-1960s. The boy was simply arranging some of the furniture, and so he went to make a bookcase in the villa's living room, and when he moved the furniture aside, he found a square piece of canvas attached to the wall. So he went to lift it, and the moment he did, he saw a face staring back at him. It was part of a fresco that showed a woman whose hair was covered in snakes. Now, before we get ahead of ourselves, fans of Greek mythology will recognize this as the Gorgon, a hideous beast that could turn people into stone just by looking at them. And the most famous Gorgon was Medusa, who was slain by the hero Perseus. And when the nephew showed this fresco to his uncle, the senator was terrified because he knew enough about the old stories to realize what the Gorgon's gaze meant. Even though it was just a picture, it could still bring bad luck. And was this actually the source of the Giolla's malediction? You might be thinking that this fresco was something new that was added by one of the villa's previous owners, but you'd be wrong. The senator's nephew was able to snap a picture of the painting before it was taken away and presented it to a scholar at the Institute of Restoration in Rome. And apparently they dated the painting all the way back to have been created sometime between the 2nd and 3rd centuries. So it's pretty old, actually. And the fact that it was covered with canvas suggests that someone on Giolla Island also realized the bad luck that the Gorgon could bring to them. But why did they bring the painting into the villa in the first place? Could this have been the curse that has claimed so many lives over the centuries on Giolla Island? And what about the Island of the Dolls? Do you think that that place is cursed too? It's hard to say for sure, but regarding all the strange circumstances surrounding Giolla Island, well, it all remains a mystery. And because all of you have made it this far into the episode, I want each and every one of you to comment down below, "The Wizard did it." So that way I know who made it to the end of the episode and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we kind of just dig into the nitty-gritty and it feels like this cinematic style of storytelling, go ahead and slap that like and subscribe button for more content from yours truly. As always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the very next episode.